across UNEA and getting really into the, into the primary climate convention across the UN system. Of course, it's my pleasure to introduce Joanna Post with the UNFCCC Secretariat's office. And as some of you know, the decision at COP25, which was hosted by the Chilean presidency in Madrid, called for the first ever ocean and climate change dialogue to discuss options for strengthening mitigation and adaptation measures across the UNFCCC. And the subsequent decision at COP26 held last year in Glasgow called for the annual occurrence of this ocean dialogue. And so Joanna, with us on the phone, has really had the enormous task of coordinating and facilitating these dialogues. And I'm really excited for you, Joanna, to provide the primary outcomes of the first dialogue and sort of give us some hints or some updates as we prepare for the second coming up in June this year, so not too far away. So I'll go ahead and get your slides up and over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jessie. Thanks very much to the Ocean Acidification Alliance. Thank you also to Lorelei and the Ocean Climate Platform. It's a pleasure, of course, to work with you, and has been a pleasure to work with you and colleagues on the line for the last few years to try and strengthen ocean climate action under the UNFCCC. I wanted to start by actually saying that the ocean is inherent in the UNFCCC Convention and in the Paris Agreement. So if you go back to the convention in 1992, its objective was to achieve stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. And the definition of the climate system in the UNFCCC is defined as the totality of the atmosphere, hydrosphere, biosphere, and geosphere and their interactions. So that ultimately includes the ocean, which is the main driver of the climate system, as we all know. Then we move along sort of really to the first time that ocean acidification was specifically referenced under the UNFCCC, which was in the Cancun Agreement, the Cancun Adaptation Framework back in 2010. And that was really the conversations that strengthened the recognition of the importance of adaptation alongside mitigation as a response to climate change. And the COP recognized at this time the need to strengthen international cooperation and expertise in order to understand and reduce loss and damage associated with the adverse effects of climate change, including ocean acidification. And then we move really to 2015 and the Paris Agreement that recognized, of course, that was really the first legal binding framework. That recognized, of course, in the preamble, the need for an effective and progressive response to the urgent threat of climate change based on the best available science. We know that science very strongly looks at these interactions in the climate system to provide information and innovative solutions. And the Paris Agreement also, as Jessie mentioned, noted the importance of ensuring the integrity of all ecosystems, including oceans. So there's a little bit of a background and history for where we've come from 92 to Paris Agreement. And the ocean community worked very strongly in 2015 to get that mention of ocean in the preamble of the Paris Agreement. But I would argue, and I do argue, that the ocean is an inherent part of the Paris Agreement, both in terms of its place being impacted by climate change. And we all know the huge impacts of climate change on the ocean. But the ocean is always also a place for action on climate change. And despite this inherent bringing in of the ocean into the UNFCCC, it was not, as Jessie said, it was not really until COP25, until the Blue COP, the Chile Madrid Time for Action in 2019, that governments recognized the need to strengthen the understanding of and action on ocean and climate change under the FCCC. And that first mandate was this COP25 was an ocean and climate change dialogue. That was originally due to take place, this was 2019, was obviously pre-COVID times, was due to take place 6 months later. It was slightly delayed. It actually happened in December of 2020. It was based quite strongly scientifically on the IPCC special report on the ocean cryosphere and a changing climate that came out in 2019. And as you see on the screen here, there are some very clear outcomes coming from that work. And the discussion was really, how do we strengthen adaptation and mitigation action under the FCCC? And there were 4 really clear dialogues that took place at the time, looking at the process itself under the FCCC, looking at the process across the UN, looking at national level action, at what can be done at the national level, and looking, of course, at finance and other support to support action on adaptation and mitigation. And there were some clear messages coming out of that on the screen. There's need to strengthen the inclusion under the UNFCCC, the need for this interactive, this work to break down silos, to build synergies across the UN, to look at how ocean-based solutions can be brought into climate conversations, and climate solutions can be brought into ocean conversations for sustainable development, for supporting livelihoods moving forward. The finance that is available for climate action is not necessarily what is needed for ocean climate action. So there is funding available, but that funding, that finance needs to be strengthened. It needs to be strengthened in the context of the 20 billion under the Paris Agreement conversations, but it also needs to be strengthened in terms of innovative solutions for strengthening blue action on climate. And we're working in this space, if you like, which is very much a busy space in the ocean, or as far as the UNFCCC is concerned, certainly within the party space, which is the as a party-driven process. We're talking coastal zones, we're talking up to EEZs, we're not talking about beyond national jurisdiction as far as the FCCC is concerned. Those conversations, of course, do take place in other parts of the UN. And then at the time, of course, the important part of the dialogue was looking at this dialoguing to talk to each other as we are doing today, to really understand what the challenges are and where the next steps are, where the gaps, where are the opportunities. And this can only take place with talking between parties, non-party stakeholders, the great work that Lorelei and colleagues are doing with the Ocean Climate Platform, for example, and so this engagement with the non-party stakeholders under the UNFCCC process. And this came in to really push forward these conversations around ocean under the UNFCCC, under the government-led process. Next slide, please, Jessie. So the outcomes of the Ocean Climate Dialogue were clear messages for the parties leading us into Glasgow. And we had a very strong outcome on ocean climate at Glasgow. I've listed it here, I won't read it out. I know that Jessie will make these slides available after this meeting, but I think what came into Glasgow for the first time is this grounding of the ocean in the work of by parties under the UNFCCC, the recognition of this interaction between ocean, biodiversity, climate, and the need for action in this busy space. The emphasis on protecting biodiversity, whilst also thinking about it in terms of its ability to absorb or act as a sink and a reservoir of greenhouse gases, particularly CO2. But of course, ensuring that this opportunity for adaptation action and mitigation action in this space builds on environmental safeguards. The push in terms of the UNFCCC process, these last 2 points on the slide, are really a push towards thinking of it in a holistic approach, thinking of it in terms of everyone should be not just working on climate, but working on climate and ocean action. So there was a call for all relevant work programs under the UNFCCC to think how they can strengthen ocean action in their work. And then the mandate for the Ocean Climate Dialogue. And that's what we're working on at the moment here at the Secretariat. Next slide, please, Jessie. There was a call coming out of the ocean, the call for the Ocean Climate Dialogue at Glasgow is quite an open call. So the SBSTA chair invited parties and non-party stakeholders to provide submissions to the UNFCCC, so we could look at, where do we go next? And what is the next stepping stone really to push for strengthened ocean climate action. At the moment, we're gathering that information together, but there's some very clear directions for this year, certainly. And the intention of the Ocean Climate Dialogue is to have a conversation around, where are these next steps, where we need to push the UNFCCC process forward to initiate action. It's not just about talk, it's about making things happen. And that this conversation will be gathered together in a summary report, which will be made available for decision making at COP. So the clear direction for this year is under the Paris Agreement, parties are asked to provide their nationally determined contributions, their NDCs, to state how they're going to implement the Paris Agreement. And in that statement, some parties, of course, are already considering ocean, but not all. So there's a very strong push this year to have a dialogue around how to make NDCs blue. How do we sort of enable that in the first place for NDCs to be blue, and then how does that action and that national action work moving forward? How do we enable international support for that? What are the current options and innovative opportunities also for funding? I see Jessie, so I probably upped my 5 minutes already. And what's next? Because I think that the conversation is not just to talk about what we have, but where do we push forward? We know that in order to respond to ocean acidification, there's an urgency for mitigation action, but the ocean is a space where that can happen. And we know, of course, that the adaptation needs to be there to respond to already the ocean acidification that's already happening. So in under the FCCC process, that's getting parties to think about, okay, in your national actions, what does that mean, and how can that be stated in NDCs, and then through the Paris Agreement process, be acted on, be supported in terms of finance and other capacity building work and technologies, and then ultimately reported back to the UNFCCC, assessed globally in a global stock take, and then obviously ambition built moving forward. And so this year we're really looking at, pushing this conversation forward. And with that, I'll stop now, Jessie, and thanks very much for the invite, and handing the floor back to you.
No, thank you so much for joining, Joanna. I know it's past 5 p.m. where you are, so I appreciate it. And also all of your leadership to bring this discussion together in Bonn. And I think coming up here in June, where the second dialogue will take place. And I really great opportunity now to turn it over to our next speaker, Bobbi Jo Dobush with the Ocean Foundation as well. And she's the lead author of a paper which actually analyzed the original submissions that were put into the 2020 dialogue. And I've asked her to give just a quick overview of her findings relative to the substance and the frequency of OA inclusions. And I think that'll, kind of help cue us up for where we want to go, at least from the OA community perspective in this next dialogue. And so Bobbi Jo, let's see, I'll stop my screen. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you great. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, ma'am. All right, well, I will turn it over to you for 5 minutes to give us a little bit of a deep dive and insight into this from last go around submissions. I'm really excited for your presentation on this. All right, so let's see.
Thank you. And as you're teeing that up, I just want to briefly introduce myself. I know some of you, but I'm Bobbi Jo Dobush. I'm with the Ocean Foundation, and I'm really pleased to be able to engage with them on ocean acidification and law and policy, and to work with my colleague Alejandra, who you heard from. But today I'm going to talk about something I did in partnership with DOSI, the Deep Ocean Stewardship Initiative. And I just want to say thanks. I'm really excited to be here. And Jessie and I were speaking last week, and I was excited for this presentation to hear about what all these different perspectives. And I think it's really important work, and it's exciting. And I'm glad to hear about how the 2022 dialogue is shaping up. So thank you for sharing, Joanna. And with that, given time constraints, I'm going to just launch right in. So next slide, please. So in May 2020, a group of colleagues from DOSI's Climate Working Group began evaluating the submissions to the first dialogue. And over the course of more than a year, May 2022, our virtual meetings were a source of solace and laughter and a dark time for everyone. But along the way, we also learned a lot about the priorities of UNFCCC parties and non-party stakeholders in the way they framed the rather open-ended responses regarding the ocean climate change dialogue. So in November 2020, in advance of the virtual dialogue, DOSI published a summary of the work we had started. And in 2022, my 6 co-authors and I published our results in climate policy. What you're looking at right now is a word cloud. And although I forgot to highlight it, but ocean acidification is there on the bottom left-hand corner. It's, of course, ocean comes up more, but it was a pretty prominent in the word cloud. Other There's other key syntheses of these submissions and of the dialogue itself. And two people on this call, Lorelei and Joanna, led those, and they're also great resources if you want to check them out by the Ocean Climate Platform and the Secretariat itself. Next slide, please. So the paper, thanks in total to my scientist colleagues, is we have a lot of quantitative data. So if you're ever curious about something very particular, we're going to talk about OA, of course, today. But the data set's online, and I know I speak for all the co-authors when I say, please reach out if you want to know anything. We've had questions, for example, about the way human rights are discussed or Indigenous rights, and we're happy to talk about any of that. But today I want to talk a little bit about specifically the way ocean acidification was mentioned. And I would like to say that we divided the analysis into topics and subtopics, and of all of those high-level topics, the most referenced was ocean and ecosystem impacts of climate change, and 91% of submissions in some way reference that, unsurprisingly. And within that, you're looking now at all of the different subcategories of ocean and ecosystem impacts, and the most referenced subcategory was ocean warming. But tied for second were sea level rise and ocean acidification. 64% of all the submissions mentioned ocean acidification directly, which I think is pretty great because it wasn't a question about ocean stressors or anything. It was just, what do you think we should be talking about at this dialogue? Other subtopics that are related to OA and that also received a lot of attention include scientific research, which was mentioned by 79% of submissions, ocean observing and monitoring, 57%, integrated coastal and ocean management, 70%, marine protected areas, 60, and nature-based solutions, 64. Next slide, please. So I know we already heard about the dialogue from Joanna. I just wanted to point out one thing I thought was cool, which were these visual artworks produced by Hazel Hurley during each day of the dialogue. You can see them on the website. I just wanted to point out in the middle here, I highlighted it in yellow. It says acidification and warming. Right in the middle, not warming and acidification. I think it's just a visual representation of how prominent OA was at the dialogue. And I just wanted to follow up on the mention of national level planning and policy, and say that one thing I noted during the dialogue was that OA was discussed in terms of a critical data gap that can sometimes hamper those conversations. And that harkens back to what Alejandra was saying. And lastly, about the dialogue itself, there was a very cool video, the Olympic Coast as Sentinel, that was by NOAA and Washington Sea Grant, focusing on the challenges faced by 4 of the tribes known as the Coastal Treaty Tribes and the challenges they have due to ocean acidification. So that was a short video that's also on the website. If anyone wants to check it out, I really appreciated it. Next and last slide, please. So really briefly, I wanted to mention, of course, coming up in June, we just spoke about the 2022 Ocean Climate Dialogue. A big caveat here, this is very preliminary numbers that we were looking at, and the examples I have below are in no particular order and completely non-exhaustive, but just a couple things I wanted to mention that were interesting. Chile submitted to that, responded to that call on behalf of themselves, Colombia, Costa Rica, Guatemala, and Panama. And they mentioned that priority topics should include combating ocean acidification through comprehensive policies and through nature-based solutions, which is something we talk about often at the Ocean Foundation. It was interesting to see the Deep Ocean Stewardship Initiative, DOSI, submitted in tandem with DOOS, Deep Ocean Observing Strategy, about needing further observations to assess the progression of climate change, including OA and other stressors, mainstreaming climate smart practices into ocean management. And I think that's something that, it's worth saying that they mentioned that recognizing the ocean is changing, planning should incorporate not only present conditions, but also changes that will ensue in ecosystems and the carbon cycle as the ocean warms, loses oxygen, acidifies, and experiences productivity shifts. And I think that's a great example of kind of bringing science to policy. AOSIS also mentioned needing to focus on OA in the context of adaptation, specifically linking this to human needs, fisheries, and tourism. I think it's really relevant that party stakeholders are recognizing that link. And last, the Ocean Foundation called for a couple, or suggested a couple panels or sessions, and one of them would be on maybe talking directly about the science around OA and other ocean stressors. And especially, relevant for policymakers thinking about the impacts and whether those are environmental, societal, economic, cultural, capacity building, legal, and policy needs. And as I said, there's a lot of other great submissions out there, and I look forward to hearing what people have to say at the dialogue itself. With that, I'm going to wrap it up, and so we can keep hearing from other great speakers. And thank you again for the opportunity.
Thanks so much, Bobbi Jo. That's a great overview to see and super helpful, I think, as we go into the second round and to sort of see the growing, at least prioritization. But I really appreciate your point of, okay, so we have some reference to the words, but what does that mean from a programmatic implementation perspective, both from the science needed to get at meaningful mitigation and adaptation. And so I know we're running short-ish on time. I think we're okay, but I did want to just quickly show folks that the OA Alliance has submitted a, has submitted a contribution to the dialogue coming up. It builds upon our 2020 submission. And I'll put it in the chat, a link to it. It's also on our website. But I want to highlight that given the IPCC AR6 report that just came out focused on climate impacts, adaptation, vulnerability, very much in line with what AOSIS put forward in their submission, we decided to call for increased guidance on ocean and coastal adaptation needs specifically across the UNFCCC. And so for us, that really means increasing and easing access to climate financing for OA measures. It means incorporating OA and other ocean climate change indicators across a range of already sort of accepted adaptation strategies like disaster risk management. We also talk about the evaluation and role of nature-based solutions, both in mitigation and adaptation to ocean acidification. Continued guidance for incorporating this work across NDCs, as Joanna mentioned, as well as NAPs, National Adaptation Plans. And then we'll talk about this a little bit more in our next presentations, but really emphasizing the proper financing that is necessary for the international monitoring work that's already being developed and shepherded through UN Sustainable Development Goals 14.31. And so for these next two presentations, what I really want to focus on is how can the work happening now through some of the science coordination that you're going to hear about, how do we pull that through, properly fund that to make sure that it can match and fit the needs and priorities of some of these discussions at a higher level.